So this idea of trauma as interrupted movement, I was really intrigued by this contrasting this idea of movement with Sumud, which is often, I guess, because it can be translated to as steadfastness, it's like kind of feels like is it staying in place, and maybe in the Palestinian context, like in a way it's about how do you weather continual storms, how do you and stay and be. And I'm Iranian heritage, I'm not Palestinian, so my knowledge of Sumud comes from my Palestinian colleagues, for instance. But I just found it such a fascinating thing to bring to the table, because I feel like it is about movement, but it's not about a literal movement. To stay in place literally, people have to continually adapt and move around and over and under the sort of oppressions of Israeli apartheid. And this is a repeated story in Palestine, I suppose, of people whose farmland has been burnt or stolen or divided, or people have been attacked during the harvest, and their response has been to resist and adapt and change in so many ways. So I think in the book there's the example is of someone who like changes what they produce on the land, and then changes how they sell it, and then just keeps adapting, keeps moving to stay in place, keeps moving to exist.
Hello and welcome to Radicals in Conversation, the monthly podcast from Pluto Press, one of the world's leading independent radical publishers. I'm your host, Chris Brown. It's great to be here with our first episode of 2026. If you're new to the show, then welcome. If you're a long-time viewer or listener, welcome back. Before we get underway properly, a quick reminder that the last 12 months' books that have been featured on the show are all 40% off for podcast viewers on plutobooks.com. You just have to use the coupon podcast at the checkout to get the discount. If you haven't already subscribed to the show, then please do. If you like what you see, then give us a like, leave us a comment in the chat, and of course, tell everyone you know to check us out as well. Okay, that's the plug over. Our first conversation of the year is with Dr Sohail Jannesari, author of the new book, The Migrant Art of Coping. Sohail is a writer and an educator exploring the intersections of migration, mental health, and social justice. We talk today about the intersecting worlds of sanctuary seeking and mental health, and talk about the ways in which asylum seekers, refugees, and other people on the move don't just survive displacement, but build strength, community, and new ways of coping that can challenge everything we know about mental health. We talk about the global apartheid of borders, how histories of colonialism have shaped mental health services today, and what a more pluralistic, marginal psychology can offer us instead. So I hope you enjoyed today's episode. Here is Dr. Sohail Jannesari on Radicals in Conversation. Okay, Sohail, it's really lovely to get to sit down and talk to you today. Thank you for coming on Radicals in Conversation. So for listeners, we're here to discuss Sohail's new book, Migrant Art of Coping, which is out from Pluto in February. I really love the book. This is a fascinating book. Holding a copy in front of me right now, and one of the endorsers on the back says, this expertly speaks to the intersection between mental health, migration, anti-racism, and decolonisation. Which definitely is true. This is a book about migration and mental health, and how these two seemingly, distinct sort of fields are very much intertwined. So, I guess to begin, you open the book, right, with this story about a chess game that you have with an Iranian man whose asylum application had been refused, as this being kind of like a pivotal moment for you as a mental health scholar and migrants' rights activist. And it's, as I say, it's where you begin the book. So could you maybe tell us something about this interaction and what it revealed to you, and I guess how it fits in with your own journey that's culminated in writing this book?
Yeah, thanks. That's that person I worked with over a couple of years, and I think they convinced me in a way. Those interactions and those experiences helped me to understand the importance and the lack of research and knowledge around supporting people who have sought sanctuary in this country with their mental health. So I start with that story because that story and that relationship is for sure important in my journey around this too. And the story is basically, I used to play chess with this person at a Iranian community group, and most of the people there were seeking asylum or had status or something like that. And he had a lot of challenges that he was working through and a lot of oppressions, I guess, that he was resisting. And I think at the time, I thought that, you know, this person is unwell. He's struggling for obvious reasons, and he's unwell, and almost like he needs fixing, I guess. And I try and talk about and be honest about some of the prejudices maybe that I have and had. And I think it's important. I used this this chess game that we had, and we had many, as a kind of metaphor to say, well, you know, I was playing him at chess, and he didn't seem that accomplished at the game, and I assumed that he wasn't, you know, focused in the right state of mind to play a game like that, I guess. But the point is that I missed it. I missed things. I missed the fact that he was even in the space and he was playing in his own style, you know, and doing his own thing in a way. And I think that's what I'm trying to say through that story and this book is that people are resisting and surviving and thriving all the time under really, really difficult circumstances. And someone like myself in that situation might only see a snapshot and be a bit judgmental and pitying or thinking that someone needs fixing, whereas actually people who are seeking sanctuary are people that we need to listen to and learn from and understand how they've managed to navigate this very hostile world and how they've managed to create community and coped and in some cases thrived in terms of mental health. And I needed to learn from him in that scenario, and I couldn't quite see that. So that's why I start there, because maybe other people are at similar places in their journey too.
Yeah, absolutely. And you've already been using the term there, like sanctuary seeking and sanctuary seekers, which is something that I guess some people probably won't have encountered before. You know, there are probably more commonplace terms that we might use, like refugee, asylum seeker. They're certainly more in the public discourse. So, what is your thinking behind this like discursive choice then? Talking about sanctuary seeking and sanctuary seekers in the book, you know, what do you think is unhelpful or inadequate about these other labels? And is sanctuary seeker a more expansive category as well, I suppose?
I think sanctuary seeker is something that is more expansive. It's basically saying anyone who has sought sanctuary by moving from one place to another, one country to another. And it's the point is not to tie people's experiences to legal status, because two people who have refugee status or two people who are seeking asylum might have wildly different experiences depending on, you know, when they've come, nationality, host society politics, and all these different potential factors. And I guess I felt like those labels were replicating government legal framings and government framings, which are inherently oppressive, and B, not really speaking to the variety of experiences that people have who seek sanctuary, and C, excluding a lot of other people. You know, someone might be seeking sanctuary here, but might be on a spousal visa or might be on a work visa or might not have any documentation. And all these people can, in theory, be seeking sanctuary. And that was often, especially from a research perspective, those understandings and that nuance is often just shut out, and it means that a lot of people are excluded, and it means that so you, at the same time as you're excluding people, you're also homogenizing people. So I am trying to use this terminology, sanctuary seeker and sanctuary seeking, but if you're doing work or research or campaigning, then what I'd advocate for is using a broad term like this and then working with the people you're working with to come up with terminologies labels and ways of speaking about sanctuary that are self-defined and that people are comfortable with and understand.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, that's certainly something that comes up in the book. I think you note that, like, when you speak to a lot of the Afghan research participants, the word like asylum seeker has very little meaning because almost everyone in their networks has gone through that process. So it's like a label that, as a white British person, that might have currency for me, but is, I guess, fairly meaningless. And yeah, the self-defining is a recurring theme throughout the book in different ways. Another like introductory concept that we might want to bring in here is, this is a book of marginal psychology. So I'd like to go on to talk about, borders, the immigration regime, the asylum process, and then talking a bit more about, mental health and decolonization in a little bit. But I guess, yeah, let's just bring this out front and center before we do that. So marginal psychology, could you say a little bit more about this? How it diverges from other approaches like, humanistic psychology or liberation psychology as well?
I mean, partly marginal psychology is about pluralism, so it's not to dismiss any other of these approaches. But I think the point is that this book is about learning from people who have been pushed to the margins, people who have a lot of knowledge to share, especially around mental health, but aren't given the platform or the time or the respect to do so. And that's not just by general society, but that's also in charities, in campaigning spaces. And I think the term I'm using, marginal psychology, is kind of trying to take the reader continually back to the point that this knowledge is coming from people who've sought sanctuary, is coming from people who've been pushed in margins. And I guess it differs to other approaches in the sense that other approaches might be to mental health might be more individualistic. Not always, obviously, like something like liberation psychology is framed around more of a activist political campaigning stream of thought. But yeah, marginal psychology is about whose knowledge we respect in mental health and trying to broaden that out. And it's about understanding that there are a range and plurality of knowledges that people on the margins use, that there is not one way to go about understanding mental health and treating mental health. And it's about acknowledging both the individual nuances, but also that how people create communities and they create ways of coping that are totally unique to their context and their backgrounds and the journey they've been on. So, as I said, it's just trying to remind the reader that this is where the knowledge comes from, and there's no absolute. It's trying to be not absolutist. There's no absolutist approach in marginal psychology. There is a range of things you can do, a range of ways you can go about it, and it's more about respecting and acknowledging and listening to where knowledge is coming from and being shared in terms of the margins.
So let's just backtrack a little bit, because the first part of the book is looking at borders, it's looking at the immigration regime, the asylum process, all of this kind of thing. So, maybe it would be good to start there then, and perhaps then we can move on to looking at mental health and how we might reapproach mental health. There's a lot of stuff around how colonialism shapes mental health services, but obviously colonialism also shapes migration policy to a huge degree, especially in a country like Britain. And I think you used the phrase "the global apartheid of borders." So, can we start there? Or like, what do you mean by this phrase, "global apartheid of borders"?
Thanks, and I should say that's for sure not my phrase, and it is from Basterman. I hope I'm pronouncing their name correctly, and drawing on theory and ideas that were developed to describe South African apartheid. And the global apartheid is basically this idea that borders create separation. They create a deliberate separation between people based on race and other characteristics, and they do so in a way that entrenches and maintains global inequalities. not just financial, but also health-wise, opportunities-wise, and these sorts of things. And there's lots of parallels you can draw with this border system to South African apartheid, and also Israeli apartheid, in terms of the militaristic enforcement, in terms of the documentation that is needed to traverse a border, in terms of the advantages it brings certain countries and peoples to maintain these borders in terms of a cheap supply of exploitable labor. So that idea is, I find, very useful in thinking about what migration looks like with borders, and obviously that leads nicely into thinking about the mental health consequences of those borders.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think, we can probably all say intuitively that hard borders are clearly not like effective on their own terms. And I think you point out quite early in the book that, sanctuary seeking is globally, it's on the rise. The lives, trials, and journeys of sanctuary seekers obviously intersect with several global issues. Perhaps we could say a little bit more then about the ways in which colonial history shapes migration policy, in a country like Britain.
Yeah, I think we are just starting to talk a little more about colonialism when we talk about migration policy. Obviously, it's quite hard to get that into mainstream contemporary debates, but it's absolutely pivotal and shapes contemporary migration policy directly, I would say. So I was thinking there are so many examples you can draw on, but I think one of the ones I might mention in a book is when British overseas citizens who were of Indian heritage were being expelled and pushed out of East African countries. They wanted to come and did come to the UK, as was their right. And it was a Labour government at the time, I think late 60s under James Callaghan. And there are records of cabinet meetings where they explicitly say there are too many brown people coming and we've got to stop this. And this leads to the Commonwealth Act, which curtails the right of British overseas citizens to come and live and work and stay in the mainland UK. So I think you can see how colonialism's directly shaped that in many ways, in terms of the fact that there were British overseas citizens to begin with, in terms of the fact that there were these group of people basically being affected by independence movements against the British Empire, and in the fact that this white supremacist ideology dictated the policy discussions and outcomes, and even that it's called the Commonwealth Act. So it's really direct, and it keeps happening. We keep making similar policies because the root causes of these policies, the drivers of these policies, are very, very similar, and they're rooted in colonialism, colonial values such as white supremacy.
Let's talk a little bit about the experiences, I guess, of sanctuary seekers who are going through, the asylum process. One aspect of this, I guess, is government accommodation, right? The sanctuary seekers might find themselves placed in upon, arrival in this country. It feels like there's, on the one hand, there's a lot of willful misunderstanding about the realities that people face, particularly people housed in hotels, right? Which, as we continue to see, are, frequently like the mobilizing points for intimidatory far-right demonstrations. On the other hand, you have like the semiotics of housing people in former prisons, or in dank, sort of unsanitary offshore barges like the Bibby Stockholm in, just off Portland in Dorset. What this says about how sanctuary seekers are regarded and treated is, I think, very interesting. But what are the psychological tolls, I guess, is the question I'm asking, for people who are housed in these different kinds of places, and the prohibitions on movement and what they are allowed to do and can and cannot do in those situations?
Again, this is a continual issue throughout the decades, I suppose, and it's come up a lot in the last few years of where to house people while they're waiting for asylum. I would say so. The first third of the book does look at a lot of the challenges and impressions people face. But I also want to highlight that the thrust of it is about how people overcome these or resist these or find ways around them. A lot of it's around circumvention. And in terms of accommodation, that also comes up. But yes, I think being housed and isolated, unsanitary, um, often just purely inappropriate accommodation, inappropriate in terms of who you might be housed with, and often in overcrowded conditions has multiple potential effects on mental health around, for instance, people often, if they've been through something difficult, need somewhere safe to recover from potentially traumatic pre-migration experiences. So that recovery period is inhibited or delayed or messed up, basically. Obviously, people are, again, coming with varying traumas, which might mean that putting them in a shared room is going to trigger them if they have any sort of post-traumatic stress sort of response. More than that, I think, or in addition to that, there is something that the government is saying about people when they are housed in these sorts of places. Is saying you're worthless, and that is something that people can internalize. It's also, again, enforcing this separation, saying that you aren't worthy of being integrated or mixing with host society. So I think there are a plethora of issues, basically, which are coming out of this accommodation, and one of which also you mentioned that when you concentrate people in certain sites, because also there is the option of, and there are other forms of asylum accommodation, which is a bit more, it's a multiple occupancy within a suburban area, and you know but when you do it in a hotel or a barracks, or you kind of create a focal point for people to express their racist sentiments. And that again has, of course, negative impacts on people's sense of self-worth, on people's sense of safety when they're already insecure, on people's ability to feel rooted in a place or a time. And again, that has negative mental health consequences. So yeah, I think there are a massive range. But I do find it also interesting. Accommodation is something that people seeking sanctuary do support each other in finding accommodation and sharing accommodation. Obviously, once you get status, you've got 28 days to leave and sort out your whole life and find another place, when obviously you've got no deposit and very few landlords are going to rent to you. And so people might share their space, share their sort of asylum support accommodation with friends. People might be in and out of asylum support accommodation, and there are mutual support networks that might host people in places that are nearer the services they need, for instance, or nearer their networks or things like that. So there is like I heard one one of the charities I was working with had someone who, I'm not sure, I can't remember if I write about this in the book or not. Someone started vandalizing their, hotel accommodation. By the way, I think hotel is the wrong word, probably comms-wise. And this charity were kind of aghast. They were like, well, this seems ungrateful, and there's a lot of that word comes up a lot.
Yeah.
But it's such an interesting and powerful thing to do in the way that they were like, they were given this space where they're told they were unworthy, but then they were reshaping it and remarking it and remolding it in a political way, which I think is good for mental health and good for agency, good for keeping a sense of self. You're being told you're worthless, but you're saying, no, it's the accommodation that's worthless, not me.
Yeah, absolutely. I suppose, and we see this again. That story is in the book, and I think then you also make the connection with the apartheid wall in Palestine, right? How that has been graffitied and artwork has been put up there, and also I'd like to touch on what you just said there about how the lack of gratitude and requirement to perform a certain type of victimhood, to maybe linked to the idea of the good immigrant and the bad immigrant, the good sanctuary seeker and the bad sanctuary seeker, to to be perceived as like angry and ungrateful, even though those are very valid feelings that one might have, to have to suppress that as you're going through a process of asylum, that is going to have an impact on someone's mental health, feelings of alienation and so on. But like what you said about how the thrust of the book is mainly about how people have like circumvented oppressive systems and had agency. If we're talking about like the enforced separation that is like designed, baked into like the way that the asylum process works in this country, for instance, it's very interesting then to read about how you give the story of like the Oplatz encampment in Berlin, right? This is people who are literally resisting the literal marginalization of how, people are housed in like Germany, often very much in the margins, coming together in a central location, and doing so in a very sort of visible way that, counters that enforced separation. Could you say a little bit more about this story maybe? Because, it's a really interesting one to read about in the book.
Yeah, I was really inspired by it. So there was this sort of policy that if you were seeking asylum in Germany, you had to stay in a certain area and you couldn't move beyond those borders, so that, there were borders within borders. And people refused this and marched to Oplatz, which is marched to a central square in Germany. And along the way, which I found particularly beautiful, they stopped off at different asylum accommodations and gathered more people. And so a real clear sort of continuing demonstration of solidarity. And I think there's this idea that, and this is what the UK government's really trying to do, right? I suppose migration is awkward for the government, and their solution is let's put these people literally out of sight, out of mind. And the previous government were like, okay, maybe we can send them to Rwanda, and varying other things have been tried, and isolated barracks, but it was something so powerful to refuse all this, refuse that invisibility, to take up space. There's a few choice quotes from some of the people involved, which I've got in there. I think someone says like, "I did this just to show I'm here," and so there's something about taking up space, but taking up space with agency, and taking up space through continued movement. So this is another theme that I tried to bring out in the book, is that there's something about borders affect mental health because they stop movement. They stop people moving in so many ways, metaphorically and literally. And at the heart of what I try to argue is that one of the most human things we do is move. We move, we change, we move place, we move in our terms of identity. And to stop that is very, very violent. And to stop that is a direct attack on people's mental health. And what people seeking sanctuary have worked out is how to move, how to keep moving, even when the whole apparatus of a state and society is telling you not to and pinning you in place. And Oplatz is a perfect example of how people kept moving even when they were told not to.
Yeah, no, I was going to ask about this because I thought it was really interesting, the idea of trauma as interrupted movement and motion and movement as being healing. And as you say, that could be as an individual, it could be collectively, it could be physical movement or psychic movement. And I suppose a lack of movement temporarily as well, the limbo people find themselves in often for years during a process, that's that interruption of movement too. So no, I definitely thought that was really interesting. And I guess in the section of the book where you're talking about that, you're also placing it alongside the idea of Sumud, right? Of steadfastness and resilience that comes from the Palestinian struggle. Could you say a little bit more about this? Because it's interesting to place it alongside this idea of movement, because I guess it's more about that idea of resilience and steadfastness, which might seem more static, but I guess is not necessarily. Could you say a little more?
Yeah, absolutely. And I should say, so this idea of trauma as interrupted movement, there was a great talk I went to by Feluke Taylor, who's a radical mental health practitioner, and really inspired me to look at that. And she's building off the work of other therapists and intellectuals in talking about that too. So yeah, I was really intrigued by this contrasting this idea of um, movement with Sumud, which is often, I guess, because it can be translated to as steadfastness. It's like kind of feels like is it staying in place, and maybe in the Palestinian context, like in a way, it's about how do you weather continual storms? How do you and stay and be and I should say, by the way, a lot of in this book, I introduce a lot of different ideas around mental health and approaches to mental health and philosophies around mental health that I'm not the expert on. I'm just introducing these as ideas from which people can explore more, and I've cited people who are experts. So I'm not. I'm Iranian heritage. I'm not Palestinian, so I only have my knowledge of someone comes from my Palestinian colleagues, for instance. But I just found it such a fascinating thing to bring to the table because I feel like it is about movement, but it's not about a literal movement. To stay in place literally, people have to continually adapt and move around and over and under the sort of oppressions of Israeli apartheid. And so there's a couple of examples, I think, in the book of people who, and this is a repeated story in Palestine, I suppose, of people whose farmland has been burnt or stolen or divided, or people have been attacked during the harvest. And their response has been to resist and adapt and change in so many ways. So I think in the book there's the example is of someone who like changes what they produce on the land and then changes how they sell it and then just keeps adapting, keeps moving to stay in place, to keeps moving to exist. And so yeah, I thought those ideas came together quite nicely.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, yeah, as you say, you talk about a lot of different ideas in this sort of section of the book. Communality is something that comes up a lot in this section, communal healing, right? And how that might be found in a variety of different ways, whether that's something like a, poetry circle or a drumming circle, or, to stick with the theme of like encampments, you talk about the Aboriginal tent embassy in Australia, which is slightly different because it's about like Indigenous peoples trying, in the land back sort of movement, dispossession from land. But, there's a lot of communal care derived from collective action. Those might be more overtly political spaces. They could be physical spaces, but they are not always physical as well. You talk about digital spaces and how these can also, digital platforms can also create communal healing. So is there anything you'd like to say about any of this? And maybe, again, we could bring in the role of diaspora here, because that was another interesting aspect of this section, that you think is relevant to share, I guess.
In terms of thinking about mental health on the level of community, so that's, I think, very vital and something that perhaps in the UK, especially the way the medical system is set up, is rarer and harder to do. I was actually giving a lecture literally 2 hours ago where we were talking with medical students about the sort of individualized nature of mental health treatment in this country. And a lot of other philosophies around life across the world. So I think I mentioned Ubuntu and Buen Vivir and Ayurveda as sort of, but there are many, many, many different ways of conceptualizing how to live and therefore what health is. Have much more of a communal aspect, and the idea is often that my mental health isn't something that happens in isolation. It isn't something that is even kept in isolation. It is part of the ecosystem of relationships that I have with lots of other people. And if something happens to me, that affects everyone. And so this idea of interconnectedness, and it says something about how we treat mental health, right? Because it is something that often is treated as a personal individual thing. but many people across the world would vehemently disagree with that. So, yeah, I think bringing in that is quite important. And then again, it's important because I found that people seeking sanctuary created communities, created sanctuary seeking communities that were cross-national, that perhaps drew from multiple philosophies because people coming from multiple different places. And I contrasted that with diaspora, and the diaspora is, I guess, more of a homogenous grouping, although there are many different factions within diaspora. Being Iranian, I can for sure tell you that. But yeah, so there's a communal understanding of mental health, and that's important. That's important to understand for wider society, and that's something that's demonstrated in the sanctuary-seeking communities that I talk about. But it's not like a given. And in the diaspora, it doesn't, you know, certain diasporas are quite fragmented, like the Iranian diaspora, and might not be a source of sometimes they can help with some practical things, but in terms of emotional solidarity and political solidarity, it is harder to come by. And so in terms of mental health, the diaspora can sometimes be exploitative or can be not particularly helpful, especially around sanctuary seeking. And therefore people might be pushed to create cross-national communities which are more towards internationalist values and more towards this understanding of communal mental health.
I mean, it was interesting, definitely reading in the book how different communities, whether that's the Iranian sanctuary seekers or Afghan sanctuary seekers, have different, I guess, cultural either expectations or like traits around like mental health, and therefore might have different ways of viewing mental health struggles. Different language that might be used, whether that's more sort of metaphorical or even how people might talk about stuff that is like psychological pain through somatic expressions of distress, how symptoms are more physically manifesting. I thought that was all really very sort of interesting.
And that's why, for instance, I use poetry in my work and in my research, because it's not for everyone, but for a lot of Iranians and Afghans I was working with at the time were using poetry to talk about, or poetic turns of phrases to talk about mental health. And since then, so we created a poetry anthology off the back of what people said. And since then, I've done a couple of poetry projects. For instance, after the racist riots, and there's been so many that it's hard to pinpoint exactly. But I think August of 2 years ago, I did a poetry project with Room to Heal and Doctors of the World and their members, where we tried to express how those riots affect people's mental health through poetry and also through art-based methods. So, yeah, it's really important, I think, when talking about mental health, and this is another lesson, hopefully, that can be learned from people seeking sanctuary, is that everyone has their own language. In different languages, literally, there are different ways of talking about and conceptualizing mental health, but also people have a personal language of talking about mental health and personal ways of expressing it, and trying to factor in that multiplicity, I think, is very important if you are trying to support people with their mental health.
Yeah, for sure. And I think you talk about like cultural humility, cultural curiosity as being important in all of this. And I think you bring that up when you're talking about your involvement in co-creating a guide for mental health professionals with Afghan community organizations, people who'd sought asylum, other members of the Afghan community. Just if you wanted to speak about that a little bit, like how did this guide that you were creating bring those two principles together in its content, I suppose, this idea of cultural humility and curiosity?
The point was not to, and we were trying to be quite clear about this, not to create like a how to of, if you are working with someone from Afghanistan who's sought sanctuary, these are the things you should do, and this is a description of the culture, because obviously Afghanistan is a place of many cultures and many languages, and beyond that, different people have, depending on your identity, you'll have a different relationship to your cultures. So there's this idea of like cultural humility, where being humble about not knowing, and then there's this sort of parallel idea about being curious and actively trying to find out in a thoughtful, considered way, because culture is essential to understanding mental health, how mental health is expressed, how people would like to be treated, how and treated, again, probably the wrong word, how people would like to be supported through whatever struggle they're going through. And I think that's with that guide, which was used in some NHS training sessions, particularly post or just after the 2021 evacuations from Afghanistan, I think, when the Taliban took over. Often the idea is to try and be more human in mental health interactions, because I guess they happen in a context which has been perhaps overly medicalized.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, we've been talking about, like, the fact that there is no single way to understand mental health, and learning from a plurality of philosophies is this sort of practical and ethical necessity to improve mental health outcomes. And I think you say in the book how the Western sort of biomedical model is seeing there are cracks appearing in it, right? Even in a country like Britain, there's more of a acceptance that maybe it doesn't have all of the answers, and it needs to look at other ways of other approaches to mental health. And I guess this gets us onto like conversations around like coloniality again, because obviously Western medicine has this long history of co-optation and extraction, as well as of the suppression and erasure of indigenous and marginalized practices. So could you say, I guess, a little bit about some of this entwined history, and I guess we can bring psychiatry into that as well, which has this history as a tool of colonialism, and then how some of this, I guess, still persists today as well?
There was this project I was working on where we were looking at how people seeking sanctuary sought and understood and accepted and took benefit from a mental health intervention. And this intervention was developed, as a lot of them are, I think, in terms of big NGO work, around mindfulness. And mindfulness is rooted in and directly taking from and stealing from Buddhist and Hindu traditions, but obviously stripping it of its religious and political cause. And anyway, in this sort of evaluation of this intervention, people express the fact that they would find this much more acceptable and they would be much more ready to engage with this if there was just some acknowledgement of the roots of this. Because people were saying, oh, this is hard to understand and it feels a bit alien, whereas actually it wasn't alien. It was something that was taken from the cultures and histories and practices of the people it was supposed to be supporting, but in such a way that they couldn't recognize it anymore. So I guess this is something that colonialism does, right? It extracts, because colonialism has to deny that the colonized has knowledge, but it's also an extractive thing which seeks to extract, obviously, resources, land, people, and knowledge. And to square this circle, it has to repackage this. It has to repackage it in a way that reflects perhaps Western scientific positivism, and in a way that makes that indigenous knowledge unrecognizable. So there is a continued practice of co-option and denial of indigenous knowledges in mental health in Western countries. And if there was acknowledgement of the roots and respect for where this knowledge is coming from, first, the treatments would be much more effective and they would be much more acceptable to a wider range of people. And just for the last bit of that question, obviously there's a parallel in how psychiatry or how mental health generally has been used by psychiatrists or psychologists or mental health practitioners to as a tool of colonialism to sort of demean and dismiss resistance. And I've got a few examples there in the book of quite egregious cases in which psychiatrists have done that. And Fanon was also writing from that perspective, right? In Algeria, working with his French psychiatric colleagues.
Yeah, some of that kind of the historical stuff there is very interesting, and I guess how we see it today, and it still presents itself in, I think, again, you outline this in the book, but like the undertreatment of certain groups, the over diagnosis of certain disorders for certain groups, and then the requirement of certain kinds of performativity and so on. I mean, decolonisation of all of this is obviously a key element of the book, and it was a big buzzword a few years ago. Kind of broke out of leftist circles into the mainstream a bit. Lots of different kinds of institutions were talking about decolonisation, from universities to museums, other cultural spaces. A lot of it was just talk, I suppose. It'd be good to think a little bit about what decolonisation might entail in reality for mental health services in particular. Given what we've just been talking about there, how might a new attunement to our sort of plurality of philosophies avoid reproducing the same old colonial patterns of, extraction? Yeah.
It's a good question, I think, because also we are lacking imagination in thinking about what decolonization might look like. And it's really cool if we're going to get anywhere to try and be imaginative. And I'm going to absolutely show how hard it is now to be imaginative by providing you a piecemeal answer to what decolonized mental health services might look like. And that's part of the nature of colonialism is to inhibit imagination. But I suppose if I were to try and imagine something, I guess it would be something that happens on a community level. It's something that's led by the people seeking support, something that embraces multiple philosophies, something that isn't spaced in clinical settings, something that is everyday, that isn't around what people lack, but what they can gain. And what that looks like concretely in the UK, for instance, is hard to envisage. But yeah, that's at least a start, right?
No, that's definitely a start. And the fact that it's not all necessarily clinical settings, you talk in the book about activism as well, organizing work, protest, civil disobedience, and how maybe there's a growing recognition that activism and advocacy can be therapeutic. So that's maybe something that traditional clinical approaches have ignored or been skeptical of. Do you want to say a little bit about how, those two worlds might be drawn together in, this sort of decolonial approach to mental health?
Yeah, it's funny, right? Because also, as an activist, I've found that it can be terrible for your mental health too. But I am arguing that activism can be therapeutic, or it can be a form of mental health therapy, because mental health happens on many levels, right? And if you just address it on, if you just focus on the community or the individual, or you're not quite getting to a society which treats mental health with the gravity and effectiveness that it needs to. And there's something about understanding, and I think people seeking sanctuary who I've worked with continually and very directly and overtly understand, and because they live it in there every day, I suppose, that there are big structures, policies, institutions that are stopping people, stopping their movement, and having incredibly negative consequences on mental health. And actions, community activities like a protest that start to address in some way, or at least react to or respond to these kind of overwhelming structural oppressions, are and can be really key for mental health, for maintaining a sense of self, for having some agency in movement. And it's something that people are doing a lot, I think. And it's about supporting each other to do it in a way that isn't sort of draining burnout. I imagine a lot of people listening to this conversation are, I guess, involved in activism in some way. So I think, yeah, and I'm again, I'm obviously there's long traditions of activism tied to therapy, tied to mental health. I and I'm bringing it out in this book because it's something that people seeking sanctuary are engaging with in one way or another, and it can be part of this therapeutic process. Yeah,
Hmm.
if therapy is even the framing we should be using. Sorry.
Yeah, well, absolutely, and I think the last section is making the point that it's not just about integrating a load of different things into the way that we think about therapeutic settings today. It's about more expansive understanding of what can be therapeutic, and you're talking about festivals, right, in the book as well as rejuvenating the participants' mental health, mental well-being. You were involved in founding the Migrant Connections Festival. That you give a lovely sort of account of what this festival is like and continues to be like. And again, towards the sort of end of the book, you're talking about creativity, joy, the erotic as well, which is something I want to come back to. I should say as well, like the book has these really lovely reader invitations throughout, where you give the reader a sort of a challenge or a little bit of homework, in a way. And these are throughout the book. And there's one kind of towards the end here, which I'll bring up because I had a go at a couple of them, right? So there's one that says, imagine waking up 30 years from now in a world where something important has changed for the better. Perhaps borders are a thing of the past, public transport is free and solar powered, or your local park has been kitted out with tree houses. Walk through this future in your mind. What do you see, hear, smell? Who is with you? What feels different in your body? So I guess this invitation could invite like a really long engagement. It's very open-ended. It's basically asking us to describe a better society, but to keep it relatively small, because this one comes just before the section that I've alluded to, where you're talking about creativity, imagination, play, the erotic. I have a 2-year-old, so I spend a lot of time in playgrounds now. And when the playground is relatively empty and you're not going to be sort of getting in the way of the other children, it's nice to join him on some of the apparatus because, who doesn't love a roundabout? Who doesn't like a really big slide or a zip wire? As adults, and I guess even earlier as like older children, teenagers and so on, but it was kind of socialized out of a lot of kinds of play. And I think that's a real shame. So my response to this invitation was that I would like to see local parks with like a lot more play equipment, a lot of people of all ages engaging with it and enjoying it. Because this is something that you give a similar story in the book, I guess. But yeah, that was my response to that invitation. I wonder what listeners might respond to that, and yeah, how would you respond to that as well? I suppose.
Yeah, thank you. I'm so glad you gave it a go. I really appreciate that. And yeah, I'm also the father of a toddler and have had a lot of fun when the playground is empty. And it's such a shame that play is erased from our adult lives because it's so crucial to so many things around mental health, around imagining another world. But yeah, I think if I were to respond to that invitation, so 30 years from now, what would I see and how would I feel about it? This might be facetious. I would want to be in a world where you there are no cars. You get out and there's like just like this like I don't know like a maybe like not an escalator, a travelator system where you can just go wherever you want and it's all and while you're traveling on that you have conversations with people and you just move into the place you're going to and yeah and I think it would feel uh relaxed. I would feel like looser in my body. I would feel um, movement without so much of the stressful drag of life. And yeah, I feel like it would always be sunny. It would have to be that these travelators of mine aren't covered. They're just um, yeah, I don't know. Maybe something like that. And there are no and you can get anywhere and it's all free and it's yeah, That's what comes to mind. Um, Now I'm thinking about it, I'm like, maybe the prompts I put in there were somewhat leading, because I'm thinking about transport.
Well, fair enough. I mean, yeah. So like we've talked about like activism. We've talked a little bit about play and joy. I guess relatedly, you kind of share the apocryphal like quote from Emma Goldman about how if there isn't dancing in my revolution, it's not my revolution. Or I'm butchering that, but you know. So this element of like joy, finding joy as well, and connection is clearly part of how we think about mental health, and you talk about Audre Lorde here at the end as well, in discussing the erotic, and I just wanted to bring it up because like I'm going to be re-releasing a video version of an episode we recorded last year with Alan Sears, who wrote a book called Eros and Alienation. It's all about this kind of more expansive understanding of the erotic. So it feels timely to bring it up here. You talk about this after the section on play. So I just love to hear a little bit more about why you feel like, joy and the erotic, this kind of stuff has a place in a book on sanctuary seeking and mental health. And then after that, maybe we can move on to just some concluding stuff. But yeah, if you had any thoughts on that.
Yeah, that's a great question. I really hope it does now that I'm thinking about it, but I think it does. So I was really inspired reading various Audre Lorde essays, and one of them is on the erotic, and it's this idea that it's not a sexualized thing. It's the idea that within us we can access this sort of deep, irrational well of emotion and connection and sensuality that I think is often eroded. It is eroded in our sort of capitalist everyday life. No matter how anti-capitalist we'd like to be, there is a distance between us and our bodies, us and our feelings, us and our skin, I guess. And so Audre Lorde talks about this in this essay, and I think why it has a place in this book is because in this section I'm talking about how we reimagine the world we live in and how people seeking sanctuary are constantly reimagining the world they live in, being forced to in a way, and being partly successful in creating this. And I think that idea of erotic is crucial in the process of reimagining and acting a world where we are mentally healthier, where we are understanding who we are, what is happening to us, how we're feeling, and making space for that in a way that is very hard to do so in the everyday of our current society. And so, yeah, I guess that's how those two things are linked in the sense that it's part of my reimagining and it's part of the reimagining that if people seeking sanctuary are creating spaces of community and solidarity in the most difficult of circumstances, then there is something to be learned from that about how we, as a wider society, how everyone can create spaces for the erotic in their everydays, even though it might feel overwhelming and it might feel difficult. So yeah, I think that's how they came together.
That's great. I mean, I guess I wanted to conclude by talking about a borderless world, because you say it might be dismissed as utopian or impractical, but that if we exercise a bit of imagination, it's not actually this unfathomable leap. So it'd be good to talk about some of the steps on the road to that. And again, talking about previous episodes, we just released an episode which talked quite a bit about Ecuador and Ecuador's 2008 constitution. That was in the context of talking about the rights of nature, which are enshrined in that constitution. But you talk about it here as well. And I wanted to bring that in because it's like, if we're talking about how we might win popular support for free movement, you say, and I agree, that it must be linked to values that people care about. And I thought the example of Ecuador's constitution was very interesting because of the way that they have embedded sort of commitments to free movement, etc., and how they sort of went about doing that in terms of the appeal to people. And I was wondering if you could say a little bit about that, and maybe then we can perhaps bring this home to a British context where obviously it doesn't feel like we're kind of on on the threshold of a bright new future, really. There's obviously Union Jacks and St. George's flags up on every lamppost around where I live. It feels very divided, and that feels like a real re-entrenching of a more narrow-minded nationalist frame of mind, really. So yeah, could you say a little bit more about Ecuador and how we can win this popular support for free movement, essentially?
Quite a few years ago now, time really does fly. I wrote a report with some folk at Global Justice Now on the case for free movement. And that was partly about trying to argue, economically, and it makes sense, or there's already steps in a way towards internalized free movement with free movement zones like the EU, and there are several others in the world. And that it's not this pie in the sky thing, that it's feasible and possible and even happening through the lens of multiple values and multiple philosophies that we may not agree with so much. And yeah, Ecuador, I guess, in the values they're bringing into their constitution is a nice example, and they're drawing on indigenous beliefs and practices, and in Pachamama and other things are folded into that constitution. And it's interesting. I would love to listen to that episode, because I wonder, is there an element of repackaging, or what happens to certain values when they are put through this sort of mixer of statehood and formalized constitution, which is set in stone, it doesn't change. And I don't know, I wonder whether but yeah, I think there are lots of inspiring examples from across the world, and even like the festivals I talk about, like those are inspiring moments where you can see and be in a space which is perhaps feels maybe that this feels a little borderless, or if it doesn't feel borderless, it feels like it makes the borderless possible. So what I was really frustrated about when writing that report, and still I'm frustrated about like many years later, is that we aren't talking enough about what borderless worlds could look like. What would it mean in terms of like how I move around, my relationships? What does it mean in terms of like how I get my health? What does it mean in terms of, what would a world look where global inequalities were gradually breaking down because people could actually move? And would we be bothered by St. George's flags? I wonder, like, would we reimagine St. George's flags to the, what is it, Greek Turkish heritage that St. George had? Or I don't know, like, how would we relate to each other in different ways? Would we teach different things? Would schools be different because people would be traveling more, and we'd have multiple languages, or we'd have a way where a drop-in system, or I don't know. But I am excited to invite people to explore. And I remember there was this activist retreat I was on, and we played with Play-Doh, and we tried to imagine the world we wanted to see. And that was one of the few times I thought that I was in a space or in a discussion where we got close to like thinking and visualizing, and okay, well, this is what things might actually look like. Not what we don't want, but what can we imagine? If we take away borders, what are all the beautiful things we can imagine that will come into our society?
Maybe that's a nice place to leave it. Yeah, Sohail, it's been lovely talking to you. As I say, I really love the book. It's called The Migrant Art of Coping. It's out from Pluto in February. So if you're listening to this in February or later, then it's already out. And if not, then it's available for pre-order now. Thank you very much for your time. Really appreciate it.
Thanks so much, Chris. Really appreciate it too. And yeah, you really read the book. I appreciate that. That's I'm like, oh yeah, that wasn't it. So thank you.
That was Sohail Jannesari on Radicals and Conversation. Once again, the new book, The Migrant Art of Coping, is out now from Pluto Press. Podcast viewers can get 40% off the book through plutobooks.com. You just have to use the coupon podcast at the checkout. Please don't forget to like, share and subscribe if you haven't already, and we'll be back with our next episode in just a few weeks' time. So until then, thanks very much for watching, and goodbye.